A U.S. plan to see Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak leave office immediately is reportedly in the works and would see a transitional government formed by Mubarak's vice president, a former head of Egypt's spy agency, and an alleged CIA point man who facilitated the extraordinary rendition of terrorism suspects. U.S. officials are discussing a plan with Egyptian officials that would see Mubarak quit immediately and hand over power to a transitional government run by Vice President Omar Suleiman, the New York Times reported on Thursday. As spy chief, Suleiman reportedly embraced the CIA's controversial extraordinary rendition program in which terror suspects snatched by the Americans were taken to Egypt and other countries without legal proceedings and subjected to interrogations. Suleiman has been the leader of Egypt's intelligence directorate for decades and has close ties to the military as well as established ties to the U.S. and Israel. This apparently makes him a suitable choice for the U.S. for an interim leader. As Egypt's intelligence chief, Suleiman was in charge of the country's most important political security files and was the mastermind behind the fragmentation of Islamic groups who led the uprising against the state in the 1990s. Suleiman has privileged contacts with U.S. intelligence and military officials with whom he has now been dealing for at least a quarter of a century. He was the CIA's point man in Egypt for rendition, says Jane Mayer, author of The Dark Side. After taking over as spy director, Suleiman oversaw an agreement with the United States in 1995 that allows for suspected militants to be secretly transferred to Egypt for questioning, according to the book Ghost Plane by journalist Stephen Gray. But while he may be liked and trusted by some in the West, most people in Egypt consider Suleiman part of Mubarak's inner circle and as such a pillar of a corrupt regime.
Suleiman, who is the head of the intelligence service in Egypt, Suleiman has eye on the presidency for a long time. He was one of the people who were, names appeared in the press many times, including his son, to be the president of Egypt. Suleiman has a good tie with Israel and United States, and the United States will not allow the Egyptian people to rule themselves.
Omar Suleiman, exactly what are your concerns with him? You are a human rights activist. We have reported on his working closely with the U.S. CIA, with extraordinary rendition. Why don't you lay out for us who this man is who was just chosen by Mubarak in the last week to be his vice president?
Sure. Look, Amy, he's been in this position as director of the Egyptian General Intelligence Service since 1993. But obviously, we only learned about this in 2007 because up until then, he was not a public persona. We did not know who the head of our intelligence service was. Since 2007, he started to appear, but again, we only knew how he looked like and we knew his name. We knew absolutely nothing about him. Until, of course, some truth started emerging about the U.S.-led so-called war on terror. And of course, his name started featuring prominently in all the books that came out, the documents that were obtained through some freedom of information requests and litigation in the United States. And that's, of course, when we started to find out that he was the most reliable partner in the Middle East in the extraordinary rendition program. He oversaw the transfer and interrogation of terror suspects, not just in Egypt, but in other countries of the region. And then, of course, there is the post-WikiLeaks era, in which we started to also read transcripts of private meetings that he held with some U.S. officials. And in them, we started to also find out more about his involvement in domestic affairs, not just in foreign policy issues, but also his role in the starvation of the people of Gaza, his role in using the economic blockade that the Egyptian government has been involved in order to pressure the Gazans to turn against Hamas, and to pressure Hamas as well to accept, to sign a deal in the Egyptian brokered reconciliation with Fatah. And interestingly, it is exactly this that he's been trying also with the protesters in Tahrir now, using economics, citing economic hardships to turn the people against the protesters, and also trying to control, at least for a few days until very recently, trying to prohibit people from taking food and medical supplies and blankets into Tahrir Square for the protesters. And then most recently, since his appointment as a vice president, he's given one long TV interview with the state television, in which, of course, it became very clear that he accused all those that insisted on remaining in Tahrir Square despite the violence and the shootings and the food deprivation. He accused all of us of implementing a foreign agenda, and he used implicit and then later very explicit threats of retaliation against us. Yes,
there's a good deal of fear that the government will retrench and then come back, again to with vengeance, if you like.
Today, with the round of negotiations or so-called dialogue that he had with some representatives of political forces, again, it became very clear that he does not enter these negotiations on an equal footing with representatives of the protesters. He sent everyone home and then decided to deliver a statement of what he called a consensus that resulted from these consultations. And later we had a number of representatives of political forces, most importantly the Muslim Brotherhood, saying that is not true. We did not agree to these things. This was only a protocol session. It is the first session of this dialogue. Each one of us expressed their views, and then we were told that we would be invited back, and suddenly we were surprised to see Suleiman announcing the understandings or agreements, as he called them, to Egyptian television. And of course, in this announcement that Suleiman made, he said, no, the president is not going to resign. No, the president is not going to delegate his powers to his vice president. And no, we're not going to lift the state of emergency immediately. We're only going to do this when there is no longer a security threat, which, of course, the government of Egypt says has been since 1981.
We are joined in Cairo by Democracy Now! Senior producer Sharif Abdel-Quddus, as well as Hossam Bagat, the Egyptian human rights activist, founder and executive director of the Egyptian Initiative for Personal Rights, who just was talking about the record of the newly appointed Vice President, Omar Suleiman, who, by the way, was trained at the U.S. Special Warfare School at Fort Bragg.
But also people who are advocating for change and advocating for reform see Omar Suleiman as Mubarak II. It is not just because of his long record or even more recent record, but it's also because he oversaw these violations, or at least he knew about them.
Egypt, Suleiman has a good tie with Israel and United States.
We have reported on his working closely with the U.S. CIA.
Suleiman has eye on the presidency for a long time. He was one of the people who were, names appeared in the press many times, including his son, to be the president.
Of the newly appointed Vice President, Omar Suleiman, who, by the way, was trained at the U.S. Special Warfare School at Fort Bragg.
And has close ties to the military as well as established ties to the U.S. and Israel.
Newly released cables from WikiLeaks reveal Israeli officials have long hoped that newly appointed Egyptian Vice President Omar Suleiman would eventually succeed Hosni Mubarak as president of Egypt. In an August 2008 cable, A U.S. diplomat wrote, quote, "There is no question that Israel is most comfortable with the prospect of Omar Suleiman." The cable reveals Suleiman's deputies spoke to Israeli military officials several times a day via a, quote, hotline. The cable reveals Suleiman's deputies spoke to Israeli military officials several times a day via a, quote, hotline.